folks pulling back their DEI statements. It's a very nuanced and complicated conversation. On one hand, what I think is most important is for the momentum that we've been building since 2020 and before to continue. For some organizations, that means flying under the radar, taking out public facing language, and just continuing to do what you do. I definitely understand that. On the other hand, I think history tells the story of those who really sacrificed so much and put so much at risk for the sake of liberation.
Loki Karuna, welcome to Unmute the Voices. So glad to have you here. Finally.
Oh, it is my honor. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. You are a musician, music activist, radio announcer, and podcaster. With the varied activities in music, you stay very busy in lots of deep, meaningful conversations centered around classical music that is online as well as at the Kennedy Center.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to know, how are you able to keep it all together, having all of these very interesting and very meaningful conversations?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And what I always think about is the center pin of my work. So many people have a sort of career trajectory in mind when they're adding different activities or taking away certain activities from their portfolio. And I think that's great. For me, it's not about professional trajectory as much as it's about life mission. So, my mission in life really is to decolonize classical music. And the way that I think about that is helping people broaden their perspectives and even their oral definitions that they connect to that phrase. What I share with everyone is that back in 2013, I had the honor of teaching at the Bahamas Music Conservatory. And just on some weekend, I was out and about. Someone heard my American accent and asked me what I was doing in the Bahamas, especially off of the resorts and that sort of thing. I was deep in Nassau. I told them that I was here. I was there teaching classical music, and they were just filled with so much joy. And they said, oh my goodness, it's just so great that there are Americans who understand the importance of teaching our youth calypso and reggae and all of these classical musics. And I didn't want to burst his bubble in that moment, but that was a light bulb moment for me. This idea of classical music is so much broader than we're taught in conservatories and than we're taught through our institutions. So from then on out, I set out to really broaden everyone's perspective on classical music. I did begin my career as an orchestral bassoonist, but I soon transitioned out to public radio and classical music media. And the way that I programmed affirmed this idea of just a broader perspective on classical music. I went on to start my own business where I get to produce radio content for public radio stations across the country independently. And since 2022, that work has also looked like supporting composers through the work that I do with the American Composers Forum and the American Composers Orchestra, all toward, again, expanding people's ideas around what classical music is. I think many of us envision a future where stages look different. For example, I envision a future where the genre sounds different as well. So that's really the center pin of my work and how I keep it all together, just staying focused on my overall mission.
So is classical music reggae music?
I would say classical music is anything that really connects to the heart and soul of a people, of a community, of a tradition. So if I use the phrase Indian classical, I think most people have an idea about what that is or what that might sound like. That's true for all populations across East Asia. When I think about the African continent, I'm thinking about the traditions of drumming that is very classic or classical to those experiences. When I think about us here in the United United States, if I try to pinpoint music that wasn't imported, but really grew from the soil of who we are as a people, I think about the field hollers, the Negro spirituals, and everything that grew out of that. Many people, can understand and wrap their minds around jazz being an example of American classical. I would go as far as to say R&B and maybe even hip hop can be considered American classical within the framework of all of the classical musics that have existed across the globe for eons. So that's really, again, what it's all about. There's nothing wrong necessarily with Bach and Beethoven and Rachmaninoff, but they are representative of one classical tradition that's rooted in Western European histories and sensibilities. My goal is to help people understand that this idea of classical music spans far beyond that.
Wow. So, do we need to, as classical musicians that have been trained in kind of the more Viennese style, do we need to be more specific in our language and educate people just in general when we're talking about classical music so that people understand that there are many different forms of classical music depending on the continent or the country in which it's associated with?
Definitely, I would say so. And I am seeing more and more of the phrase Western classical being passed around. I do appreciate that level of specificity. But when we think about training, our conservatory training, the teaching isn't only centered in Western European sensibilities, but really in classical and largely romantic eras of that sensibility. I work with a lot of composers who are interested in writing music that require musicians to improvise. We largely associate this with jazz and
Yes, yeah.
American classical tradition. But if we look back, even in Western Europe, the Baroque tradition included lots of improvisations when we think about cadenzas and those sorts of things. So for me, it's not just a naming convention, it's ways in which we can identify the limitations of our training and expand so that we are better musicians and that the audiences that we present our art to get a better sense of what we're capable of bringing to them.
So, do we need to create some sort of revolution, or what do you suggest in how we are able to kind of adapt this new mindset of what classical music is?
Sure. So I think one thing is to really critique and interrogate the way we just use the phrase. If we're talking about what most people here in the United States think of as classical music, I think it's important just to name Western classical music. Beyond that, I think it's very important for presenting institutions, whether they be orchestras, opera houses, all of those sorts of infrastructures, to really look at what it looks like to expand the aesthetic of your ensembles. And I think this can largely be done by utilizing living composers who come to the table with contemporary sensibilities and contemporary perspectives. By centering living composers, I think we can get a little closer to it. And then the third thing that I would say is for classical music, so-called classical music media, to also engage this broader perspective. I've had the opportunity to host a lot of live radio and even do some guest radio spots. And when I do those guest spots, I always try to slip in maybe a little something by Nina Simone or maybe even one Drake track or something that I feel like generally fits the aesthetic of what people are trying to listen to, while at the same time expanding their thinking around what belongs in those spaces. I think when we expand our definitions surrounding classical music in those ways, and in many ways, we won't only be experiencing a diversity of sound. I think it will diversify our audiences and help more people understand that they belong in our spaces as much as this music that hasn't always been deemed classical, quote unquote, also belongs in those spaces.
Well, I don't know. Drake might have something, or rather, Kendrick might have something to say about that, about involving Drake in that. So I don't know if you run
Absolutely.
that.
I'm not here to get political. Love Kendrick, Pulitzer Prize winning
but
composer. I would call him. Let's put him in the mix as well.
but to the point is when we're talking about Western classical music, that also includes jazz, right? That also includes hip hop music. Do we need to actually make a distinction there when we're talking about Western classical music? Do we need to say the music of Europe, or do we need to say the music of America? Like, because people would argue that that's a very broad genre to throw lots of kind of, I guess, subgenres under that, between Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Drake, Kendrick, Nina Simone, etc. Do
Hmm.
they all need their own kind of sub genres, or do we need to categorize all of these different types of music when we're talking about classical music?
I think ultimately the goal would be to make sure that that phrase does encapsulate all of that. I definitely hear your point about it being very broad, but let's go back to quote unquote traditional uses of the phrase classical music. The music of Bach is very different than the music of Stephen Mackey and David Maslanka. You know, the music of Rachmaninoff is very different than the music of John Cage. So we're already talking about something that's extremely, extremely broad. I see no difference in the proximity between those composers as there is between folks like Kendrick and Aaron Copland. I think it's already a broad thing that we're talking about. We just should make it far more inclusive in that broadness.
Hmm, that's interesting. So, what's your relationship then with the broadness of classical music? How have you evolved as a musician and as a person?
Sure. So I grew up, I live in New York, but I grew up in the city of Memphis, home of the blues. So that's just what was in my ear growing up, walking down Bill Street, really being anywhere. You can't miss the blues, it's everywhere. I also grew up in the Black church. I do practice Buddhism now, but growing up in the church, I was always engaging spirituals, gospel. You know, the church is where I learned how to read music, how I learned the difference between a melody and a harmony. It's very much a part of my a foundation. And I consider both of those so-called genres, quote unquote genres, American classical. Now, fast forward, you know, after years of singing in the church and singing in school choirs, I figured that it was time for me to learn how to actually play an instrument. So when I was 12 years old, I walked in the band room. The band director handed me a bassoon, and the rest was history. I fell in love. I was lucky enough to win several auditions. Spent the first decade of my career making a living as an orchestral bassoonist. But you know, after about 10 years, I just noticed that the experience that I felt engaging music as a kid and growing up in Memphis was so much different than what I was engaging professionally. I knew that there was a lot more out there to be engaged and for audiences to hear. So you know, with that mission in mind and the experience that I talked with you about earlier in the Bahamas, that's what prompted me to go into the world of public radio, of classical radio. Lots of people engage live music, even more people engage radio. So when I entered that field, that really was always my goal. And the way that I programmed definitely put me on the map. I had the opportunity to host national radio. And here we are today with me continuing in this mission in every other way that I can as well.
So, what would you say that classical radio hosts or announcers, or even just the company at large, need to do in order to bring more people into the genre of classical music?
The big thing I would say is to expand for all classical media professionals to just expand your awareness. You know, my very first radio job was at WUOT in Knoxville, Tennessee. So shout out to everyone down there. I was on the air 30 hours a week. I had an afternoon slot, but I probably spent close to 100 hours a week in the stacks, in the music library, really reading all of the liner notes and discovering all of these composers who I had never heard of. One composer that's coming to mind immediately is a woman named Angelica Negron, who I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. So, you know, just folks who I had never heard of. I became so interested in, and it really helped expand not only my awareness of the genre as it's been traditionally engaged, but also the folks who were expanding and doing things with electronics, with improvisation, other sorts of mixed media. So I would say that hosts, announcers, and everyone beyond should just spend some time listening, reading, and seeing what else is out there.
Unmute the Voices is sponsored by Key to Change Studio. Key to Change Studio is a violin and viola studio located in Renton, Washington, which allows middle and high school underserved students living in South King County an opportunity to take violin or viola lessons. For more information, visit their website at keytochangestudio.org. Now, back to Unmute the Voices. Back in 2020, there was a major push and some pressure for companies and organizations, especially within classical music, to release DEI statements. Now that the government has publicly denounced DEI, we know that these institutions are retracting their statements. Do you believe that as statements are retracted, that the work with these organizations will fizzle out, or is it acceptable for them to retract because they are actually doing the work?
It's a very nuanced and complicated conversation. On one hand, what I think is most important is for the momentum that we've been building since 2020 and before to continue. For some organizations, that means flying under the radar, taking out public facing language, and just continuing to do what you do. I definitely understand that. On the other hand, I think history tells the story of those who really sacrificed so much and put so much at risk for the sake of liberation. So for any organization that is retracting under the guise of falling under the radar or flying under the radar, I would just really make sure that you're doing that. There are lots of folks out there like me who are always looking out for the most equitable organizations, the organizations that really are pushing the hardest, and those are the ones that me and folks like me will always be more attracted to. But with that being said, I definitely understand that money makes the world go round. Money certainly makes our industry move forward. So if there are ways that organizations feel like they can continue to do this work without the public statements, I suppose that's what has to be done.
Hmm. Hmm. What do you believe is missing from classical music organizations? And this includes music schools, orchestras, etc., and how they engage with the community. What do you think is really missing?
I think there are many things. The first thing that comes to mind is just a level of courage. Again, as we were talking about folks pulling back their DEI statements, it takes a lot of courage to stand against oppressive powers. And I just want to make it clear, if it were up to me, all arts organizations would keep their statements, keep their dedications, and continue to move forward. I think history will ultimately reward those who had the courage to really not retract. So I just want to make sure that I'm being clear there. In addition to just general courage, and the aversion to risk that we see in the industry, I think a true understanding of what cultural proximity is something that's missing from arts organizations. There are lots of orchestras and conservatories out there who have DEI departments, maybe certain affinity groups, but how do those connect to the actual community? Who are you hiring that can go to these neighborhoods where some of your staff have never been or might be afraid to go? I think creating that true proximity is the other thing that's really missing. In my personal life, I try to make sure that I'm always buying from the ground when I move to another city. I'm not looking for whatever is the quote unquote nicest neighborhood. I really do my research, find out where Black folks or people of color are gathering, where those businesses are, and I make that my home. That's why I'm so proud to live here in the Harlem, Washington Heights area of of New York. It's just that independent sense of responsibility to actually connect with people on the ground that I think is missing. Last year, I read the autobiography of Huey P. Newton, and for those who don't
Mm.
know, he
Hmm.
co-founded the Black Panther
Black
Party.
Panthers, yeah.
And one of the things that he said in the conclusion of his autobiography was that movements die when the movement leaves the people. So many of our institutions live in these proverbial ivory towers that we always talk about, but don't really address the single mother who's just trying to get her kids fed, or the student who's struggling to work a part-time job to put themselves through school. What are the actual connections that arts institutions can make to those individuals on the ground? That's the question that I would ask anyone who I was sitting in front of at this point.
That's beautifully stated, Loki. How does an organization develop courage within its DNA?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say get some courageous people in the room. There are so many folks who could help us in this industry who did not go to conservatories, who do not play instruments, but really do have a sense of community organizing and just building rapport. So I would say get some of those folks in the room.
Yeah, but what you're saying is so profound. But I want to explore this word of courage,
Oh, sure.
of how does an organization not mistake courage for adversary?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I think courage is largely grown from compassion. I think, if we do really want to center the discussion around classical music, we have to understand that so many things developed here in the United States in conjunction with and in connection to the development of classical music. There are arts institutions that exist today that were in full operation during Jim Crow. There are one or two that were in full operation during antebellum slavery. There's a reason why those institutions could exist alongside such historical horrors, because there was an idea of not only who belongs in those spaces, but what belongs in those spaces, those types of music. So I think really being honest about that history and Western classical music's proximity to those histories will can help cultivate some understanding around the topic. And once that understanding is there, there has to be some true compassion for the people who are still dealing with those things, who are the sons and daughters and children of that struggle. When the compassion is really there, that's where I think the courage can come forward to do everything we can to not only affirm those lived experiences and that history, but to change the course of where we're going. It will very much, I'll say, you use the word adversarial, it will very much feel that way to some people because the status quo runs along the lines of the white supremacy culture that surrounds classical music, that has long surrounded classical music. So it will feel adversarial, but that doesn't mean that we can't bring people along with us. I think dialogue is absolutely key. For many years in my life, especially as an activist, there were folks that I was just not interested in talking to, not interested in having any connection to, because we just don't see eye to eye. There's no way that I could ever convince this person of my perspective or learn anything from them. That's something that I have really changed in these past 5 or 6 years, thanks to my Buddhist practice. I think dialogue really is the key to understanding, having the courage to learn from someone, having the courage to be vulnerable, and what you try to help other people understand about you. All of these things, I think, contribute to the question that you're asking. How can we develop this courage. We have to learn about each other. We have to face the facts of our circumstances. We have to dialogue, and we have to not be afraid to do things that have never been done before.
Well said. And I think the underlying point of all of that too is forgiveness, right? Is the reconciliation
Mm-hmm.
piece that also requires courage,
Absolutely.
right?
It's something that you use that word forgiveness, because that's something that I've had to explore, not for individual people. I need to forgive these people, but I need to forgive myself for
Mm,
being the product of a specific sort of system. Again, I mentioned that I grew up in Memphis. When I entered that band room as a 12-year-old, all the way through, earning my master's degree in bassoon, we didn't talk about blues. We didn't talk about jazz. We didn't talk about Nina Simone or W.C. Handy. All of these important people to the tradition, Louis Armstrong, all these important people to the tradition of American music. That was something that I was bred from. And instead of being so angry at that system all the time, I had to figure out how to forgive, have a sense of forgiveness, not to hold that inside of me, but rather to accept what it is and to see what I can do to change that for the next generation.
wow. What keeps you up at night as an activist?
That's a really great question. What keeps me up these days is thinking about the degree to which artists and those of us who support artists have never really engaged true resistance. I think so much that goes into success, career success for a Western classical professional, is adherence to certain norms that I feel like we should not adhere to. As we keep an eye on the news and everything that's happening at the Kennedy Center, I think we are seeing in plain sight those who have the courage, back to that word courage, but also the privilege to separate themselves from institutions like those, and people who either don't have the privilege to be able to do that or just aren't willing to do so. I often question, what will it take for people to actually see what's happening in our country and in our arts community, with the cancellation of the Pride events at the Kennedy Center later this year. My feeling was that everyone would begin to raise the red flag, but that isn't happening. I wonder what has to happen. Do Black people and people of color need to be barred from entering the Kennedy Center before people say, okay, we need to really oppose what's going on there? Let me speak extremely, extremely hyperbolically. Do people need to be killed, executed outside of the Kennedy Center for people to say, oh no, something is wrong? So I would say that's really what's contributing to some of my tossing and turning these days. Just people understanding that pushing against is something that we have to do. Business as usual is not resistance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And really, the bottom line is that all of these decisions are being made really for more money,
And
for
I
more
think
money
and
and
I think
greed.
ultimately when we talk about, bridging gaps and building community, it's very easy and necessary for us to have the conversation on a sort of racial front, especially considering the history of our country. I think ultimately the biggest challenge is the way in which capitalism has really defined so much of what we do, for better and for worse. I think we're many years away from actually having the class consciousness dialogue on a mass scale, but that's what I do see in the future, and something that I hope more folks in the arts will consider as we all develop thoughts, opinions, and initiatives toward making this a better world.
Wow. Fun question for you. If you had to give a 30-second pitch on converting your favorite celebrity to listen to westernized classical music,
Mm-hmm.
who would the celebrity be? And what would you say to them to get them to listen?
So the celebrity will most certainly be Beyonce. And what I would say to her, I would first thank her for everything that she's done in her career to shine a light on the diversity of American music, of Black perspectives on music, both or including rather the R&B. We've heard her rap. At this point, we've heard her do country music. There's been some gospel sprinkled in there. There's so much that she has given the world and has put on the radars of all of her fans. I would encourage her to understand that there's even further to go. There are women like Margaret Bonds and Florence Price who were out here, trying to do the same thing that she has done in a different context. There are living Black women composers who are continuing that tradition. So I would tell Beyonce, in short, thank you for everything that you've done. Please consider the artists who are doing it over in our world and who have done it historically.
Well, Beyonce, the next album, what do you predict? Rap album, rock album? What do you think? Any predictions?
You know, I would love a rap album from
Me
Beyonce,
too.
but
Thank you.
but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking she's either going to go rock or jazz. So some people may remember the Lemonade album. There's a tune on there that was very much rock inspired. So I could definitely hear her going down that pipeline. But when it comes to the jazz, I think about what Queen Latifah gave to the world. She's done
Yeah.
lots of jazz performances and even created a really phenomenal jazz album, probably over a decade now, that I used to listen to all the time. So I think we could see either, but quite frankly, whatever she gives us, I'm buying.
Period. I'm crossing my fingers for a rap album, but I think you're right. It's gonna be rock.
And hey, there's deep, deep, deep connections to the history of rock and Black folks. I think about Black punk bands like Bad Brains that were out here really
Yeah,
doing it.
yeah, yeah.
Last year, I went to Afropunk and Erica Badu headlined, and it was very much a rock set. A an aspect of her artistry that I had not yet engaged or was aware of. So it would be great if Beyonce could give us some kick drums and some electric guitars and all that. I think it'd be cool.
Thank you so much for being on this show. Wow, you just dropped a lot of gems.
Oh, it is my pleasure, and I just want to make sure that people hear me correctly. Circling back to your question about these DEI statements, organizations and individuals do what they got to do out here to survive. I see and understand that, and I encourage everyone to do that because you can't resist if you're dead. You can't resist if you're broke. That's just how I see that. At the same time, as I said, history will celebrate those who have the courage to not pull back. And I hope that we all can find somewhere in ourselves every way where we can not retract while also staying alive and staying in the battle.
Period. Thank you so much for being on the show.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Thank you. And thank you as well for watching this episode of Unmute the Voices. I'm Dr. Quinton Morris. Enjoy your day.